Hi guys, it's time of the year when climate change is a hot topic again. Smart and educated people believe that climate change is real, scientists have a consensus and we must act now to stop CO2 emissions. People who disagree with that position are portrayed as stupid and educated rednecks believing in conspiracy theories, ignoring all scientific evidence. As a person with a mathematical background, I was trusting the science, but at some point I was like, can I get the full explanation of the so-called consensus? Where can I see your models? Who are the authors of the theory? That task was way more challenging than I thought, and I asked my friends with degrees in physics. They were all happy to help me with Einstein's theory of relativity or quantum physics, but had no clue about climate change. I find this extremely odd. Climate change can be harder than quantum physics, so I had to do my own research and I found quite a shocking stuff, which I want to share with you today. And I promise there will be zero references to any conspiracy theories. We will look into what scientists actually say, mostly those who are pro-climate change. The most important in science are definition. What exactly is climate change or climate crisis? To make things confusing, there are three definitions. First, climate is changing and we need to do something about it. This is probably the most common colloquial definition, and the problem with it is that we don't want to fight the climate change in general, but only man-made climate change. A better definition would be climate is changing primarily because of human activities and we need to do something about it. Here again, the problem is not that all human activities matter, we only care about CO2 emissions. The most correct definition would be climate is changing primarily because we burn fossil fuels emitting CO2 and we need to do something about it. Now look, the recent temperature rise, which is hard to deny, must have three different components: natural reasons, human activities and CO2 emissions. For some reason, science only cares about the last one. Can nature change the climate? Obviously. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes and landslide can reshape the land. For example, in 1968, there was a landslide in Tajikistan which blocked the river and created a Sarets lake with the highest depth of 500 meters. That's an enormous amount of water being trapped and a huge change in the local ecosystem. Human activities are even more concerning. With the population almost doubled for the last 30 years, especially in Africa, this requires more land to grow food, meaning that forest is being cut to make more land for agriculture. According to the UN, 4 million hectares of forest are being destroyed per year in Africa alone. This is the size of Netherlands. This surely has a significant effect on climate. To prove that climate change is real, in our third definition, it's not enough to prove that CO2 has a significant impact on the climate. You also need to prove that other two causes have virtually zero impact. If this is proven, it's still not enough to make it a global emergency. For that, you need the next two statements to be true. First, it's getting warmer and it's the hottest time in the last 2000 years. If it was warmer, let's say around the year 1000 AD, then maybe it's not an immediate threat. Second, warming is bad for the planet. Warming produces good and bad effects. If there are more good effects than the bad ones, then maybe it's not an immediate threat. In today's video, I will be challenging these two statements, and in the following video, which I will post within a week, I will challenge the main statement about CO2. Otherwise, it will be too long and you will lose me. Both videos are equally important, so I advise you to fully watch them. So, let's start with the real science. How the Earth's temperature has been changing for the last 2000 years. As I told you, there are no authors of the climate change theory, and the biggest source of truth is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Reports, which is IPCC for short, which is basically a summary of consensus of world climate scientists. It's designed to be read by the policymakers and rarely contains actual science, but often you can have links on scientific papers. Here's the latest 6th IPCC report and the graph, which you have seen many times, colloquially called the hockey stick. Basically, the Earth had a very stable temperatures for the last 2000 years, and then around the year 1850, the Industrial Revolution started and the evil man started to dig out sacred fossil fuels from the Earth and burn them to get energy, emitting CO2 into the atmosphere, and the Earth's temperature started to rise. That correlation looks scary. Now, let's open the previous 5th report of IPCC from 2014. In its technical part, there are temperature reconstructions taken from various scientific papers. That looks very different from the current report. No more hockey sticks. Here temperatures were quite dynamic in the past, and one of the graphs actually shows very high temperatures around the year 900, almost like the current ones. But the most problematic is that these reconstructions are completely different. Where is the promised scientific consensus? Look, only one of these graphs can be correct. Which one? Maybe none? The most important question, how is it possible that this got transformed into this in a matter of 7 years? Have we got any breakthrough in the temperature reconstruction recently? Nope. The answer is pure data manipulation. In the technical section of 6 IPCC, it's explicitly explained that that graph of a hockey stick is an IR6 assessed mean 10-year smoothed, meaning that they took a bunch of these completely different, inconsistent and incorrect reconstructions, calculated mean value of that crap, smoothed it and declared this as a scientific consensus. That's truly shocking. It reminds me how some people try to prove God's existence by saying that, yep, you have so many religions, the dogmas are completely different, but pretty much every society has an idea of God. Therefore, God must be real. Now, why do we care about the last 2000 years? The most interesting time for human development started from the end of the last ice age, which was 11.7 thousand years ago. That's when humans developed agriculture and our civilization was created. How did the temperature change over that period of time? To prepare for that video, I was listening to a talk about climate change from CERN, a very respected physics institution in Switzerland. In one of the slides, they claimed that the temperature over the last 11,000 years was pretty much the same. Basically, we have a super hockey sticks. There were two different reconstructions coming from two different scientific articles showing a similar picture. Therefore, they claimed a scientific consensus. Well, it's not a secret that the map of Europe was quite different 9,000 years ago. The ocean level was significantly lower and British Isles were connected with the rest of Europe. It's hard to believe that the whole Earth got reshaped since then, but the average temperature remained the same. Luckily, I'm not the only one who has those doubts. In the 6th IPCC report, in its technical section, there is another reconstruction which shows the range of possible temperatures. According to it, the temperatures 6,000 years ago could be as high as the one right now. Oops, it's not a proof by any chance, but there is no consensus among scientists. I'm really sorry. Now let's try to be scientists and look at undeniable facts about the past climate, which can be verified by an ordinary man without any mathematical background. First, there is an amazing place in the Algerian desert called Tassili n'Ajjer National Park. Now it's a lifeless desert, but it's a part of UNESCO heritage because it contains a bunch of amazing prehistoric frescoes. Elephants, rhinoceroses, buffaloes, hippopotami, crocodiles, antelopes. All these species no longer exist there, and the only way they could have existed in the past is a much wetter climate. This place is not unique. You can find similar frescoes across the Sahara Desert 1,000 kilometers away. The dating of these varies, but all of them were made after the end of the Ice Age, which is 11.7 thousand years ago, and there are no more frescoes after 2000 years before present. The current scientific consensus is that the Sahara was a lifeless desert during the Ice Age, and then 11.5 thousand years ago it changed into wet and lush area, good for pastoralism and agriculture. And then gradually it started to become desert again. It doesn't tell you much whether it was colder or hotter back then, but surely it was more wet, which contradicts the dogma of stable climate. Next, the most important place in human history is Fertile Crescent between river Tigris and Euphrates, the place where first agriculture and first civilization came into life 10,000 years ago. I was there last year and it looks absolutely depressing. That area is basically a desert and agriculture there is quite limited. It's hard to imagine that this was the birthplace of the crop domestication, unless the climate back then was different. The current scientific consensus is that these lands were much wetter 10,000 years ago and then started to become dry for the last 2,500 years, which led to collapse of these civilizations. Let's move to Roman Empire. These people knew how to read and write and left us a bunch of records which can help us to understand what was going on back then. Ancient writers like Livy describe quite cold conditions in Rome around the year 300 BC, with snow laying many days, and River Tiber was frozen in the year 271 BC. Then, much later, around year 50 AD, other authors like Pliny tell us that Rome's climate is too warm now and the olives can be grown much further in Italy than it was accustomed in the previous century. Large Tiber floods occurred in 5, 15, 36, 51, 69, 79 and 97 AD. The wine was introduced in England in 280 AD, which was a part of the Roman Empire back then, and by the year 300 AD there were no longer wine imports from Italy, suggesting that England was able to produce enough wine to support itself. Nowadays, England definitely is not a big wine producer, which gives us a hint that there was a very different climate there in the past. The Ptolemy of Alexandria, which is in Egypt now, kept a weather diary about the year 120 AD. The rain occurred every month except August, and there were thunderstorms in the rest of the summer month. Now the climate is much drier, as you can see, and there is physically no water to make any thunderstorms. There is a huge pile of written evidence that the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, the golden age of the Roman Empire, was associated with the warmer and wetter climate. Then there was a period of the great migration from Asia of various barbarian tribes like the Huns, Magyars and Turks, who forced European barbarians like Germans and Slavs to move into the Roman Empire, which led to its eventual destruction. The reason why they migrated out of the Central Asia is debatable, because barbarians haven't left much of the records, but the leading theory is that there was some kind of a climate change. Another important event was the medieval warm period from 950 AD to 1250 AD. That was the time where Vikings colonized Iceland and Greenland and even established a summer camp in America. Then temperatures started to fall around 1350 and ships were no longer able to reach Greenland, and people who lived there could not adapt and probably died out around 1400. In the continental Europe, the climate became significantly colder as well. Wine production in England was ceased, the River Thames was frozen regularly, some parts of Netherlands were covered by the snow. In the French Alps we have records of villages being eaten by the advancing glacier. In 1709, the year of the Great Frost, the Venice Lagoon got frozen. In 1780, during the American Revolution, there was the coldest winter and the Hudson River in New York was completely frozen. These are all very well documented facts, both in written records and in art. The period of so-called Little Ice Age lasted for quite a long time, until the year 1850, roughly the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Now you might tell me it's all blah blah blah, some kind of historical records which we can't verify. Can you give us a definite example? Sure. The example comes from Switzerland, where there is a Schniederjoch Pass at 2700 meters, just a bit south of Bern. There was a glacier on the top, which gradually was being reduced by climate change. Finally, in 2003, there was an extraordinarily hot summer and the glacier got fully melted, revealing a bunch of Bronze Age artifacts lying under ice. Scientists decided to make a proper excavation and found a bunch of interesting objects from various times, starting from 4600 BC until 1000 AD. Radiocarbon analysis shows that this pass was regularly used as a summer trading route from valley to valley during the ancient times, meaning that there were no permanent glacier there. There is a scientific article with a list of all found objects and their age, with a clear indication that it was continuously used from 0 AD to 1000 AD, and then nothing was found for the next 1000 years. This suggests a couple of bad things. The temperature in 2003 was as high as in the year 1000 AD, and according to NASA, there was a rise of 0.6 Celsius since pre-industrial times, and now it's 0.9, meaning that the recent temperature rise might not be as bad and we are basically recovering from the Little Ice Age. There are other examples of similar discoveries in the Alps. In public perception, glaciers are being used as the most obvious proof that climate change is real and that we have to do something about it. Glaciers are melting and I can't deny that. The question is when the glaciers were created. What if the most of the glaciers which got recently melted were created just 500 years ago? If that's true, the situation is not that dramatic at all. Well, I found a pro-climate change article with an alarming title talking about the glaciers in Spain which survived the Roman and medieval warm periods but disappearing now. There is an amazing picture of the life of that glacier over time. So it was initially created 5,000 years ago. There was another little ice age back then. Then it shrunk during the Ice Age, and then almost nothing left around the year 1000 AD. Then the Little Ice Age restored it back. And now there is a similar picture to what it was at 1000 AD, meaning that it's almost gone again. And the conclusion of the authors that this is an emergency, which I disagree with. The most important conclusion is that glaciers are not permanent, they were recently created, and melting of them is nothing extraordinary. Another personal observations about glaciers. I was in Los Nevados in Colombia and I have seen an enormous retreat of the glacier. Here is the picture of it from 1959 and 1996 and 2002. Clearly a terrible loss. And just 500 kilometers away, there is a Cotopaxi volcano in Ecuador. Here is the map of its retreat from 1987, 2001 and 2016. Surely it's getting smaller as well, but the scale is not comparable. Why one of the glaciers is dying out so fast and another one not so much? The reason is nearby agriculture and deforestation. In Colombia, the land around the volcano was transformed into pastures in the recent time, driving away all the moisture needed to rebuild the glacier. In Ecuador, Cotopaxi and the vast area around is national park, full of trees and zero human activities. And I'm not claiming that the glaciers are being melted solely because of deforestation, but human non-CO2 activities have a huge impact on the climate, and it's a clear case supporting it. So, we've got a clear evidence of the Roman warm period, medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age. And for some reason, the first two periods are indistinguishable on the hockey stick. And Little Ice Age is marked with only 0.2 Celsius decline. How the climate change scientists, or rather their advocates, explain that weird inconsistency? Well, their arguments is that these periods were local events. They were limited to Europe, Middle East, Sahara, Northern America. But the average temperature on the Earth remained the same. That's what science says and there is a consensus, blah blah blah. This is kind of gaslighting, because to call these local events, you need to have a proof. If the climate in Europe was warmer, you need to show the place where it was colder to make a counterbalance. No such proof were provided, and the written records in China, which tell us how far north the tangerines can be grown, doesn't suggest any counterbalance. Before we look deeper into how scientists actually made their reconstructions, let's debunk another media hoax: the rise of ocean levels. Antarctica is melting, we're all going to be underwater in a couple of years. This crazy nonsense is very popular. Well, if you put an ice into a cup and wait until it's melted, the level of the water will stay the same for quite an obvious reason. The Arctic ice is not a problem. The melting glaciers on the land can increase the sea level, but they are too rare and relatively small, so it's not a problem either. What is likely to be a problem is permafrost. The whole northern land, just a couple of meters below the surface, there is basically a frozen ice mixed with soils and stones. That's an extremely large quantity of water, and that going into the ocean can shift the needle. Let's check the official science on climate.go. You can read that because of climate change, the current rate of sea level rise is 3.6 millimeters per year, not 1.4 millimeters as it was most of the 20th century. 3.6 millimeters per year is only 1 meter in 300 years, which is a joke and not a threat at all. Dutch managed to build a system of ditches to reclaim a bunch of land since 13th century. Can't we build something similar over the next 300 years? The actual problem here is the recent rise of the speed by 2x, which is blamed on climate change. If speed continues to rise, we might have only 100 years to solve this 1 meter problem. But there is a manipulation here. If you look at the graph of the sea level, you don't need to hold a PhD in statistics to understand that it's not really 2x. It's 35 millimeters per last 2 decades and 25 millimeters for the preceding 3 decades. Everything else beyond the year 1970 are not measurements but some kind of model estimate. So we can say that the speed has been increased by 1.4x in the last 2 decades. 1.4 is quite a bad acceleration as well, so we need to dig a little bit further. How is the sea level being defined? It might sound like a silly question, you just need to go to the sea and measure the freaking level. Well, the problem is that there is, for example, an ancient city of Ephesus, which I visited last year. There you can see a ruins of an ancient harbor from 2000 years ago. Well, there is one problem. There is no water there, and the sea is 5 kilometers away. Crazy. At the same time, if you go to Naples, you can snorkel and explore ancient Roman mosaics at the depth of 5 meters. The point here is that you have a bunch of local movements of the landmass independently of the sea. In some places it is stable, in some other places it's not. Earthquakes can move things by centimeters. Because of that, global sea level is not that easy to define. What is easy to define is a sea level at one particular place. And here is one for Kushiro, Japan, which is unstable. It jumped up in the 90s and has been going down since 2015. Another example is much more stable place in Warnemünde, Germany, and it shows a constant increase since 1855. Another one is from Washington, where there is a constant decrease. There is absolutely no correlation with CO2 or warmer temperatures. And as you can see, there is no recent increase in speed as Climate.go claimed. All these data are public and provided by National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and you can find these graphs online and check each station around the world to verify on your own. So what is the reason of the sea level rise? Scientists have no clue. The sea level constantly rises since the end of the Ice Age, which is 12,000 years ago, independently of temperatures. Physics suggests that with the hotter temperatures, the sea should be higher because of the expansion and the extra water from the permafrost. But there is some counter mechanism which scientists haven't discovered yet, which makes a counterbalance. Anyway, the point is that sea level rising has nothing to do with the current climate change, and there is no immediate danger here. Now it's the time for the final piece of today's video. When you look at all these reconstructions, you might say, yeah, it's all inconsistent and bizarre, but all the graphs show that we live in the hottest time in the last 2000 years. None of the scientists claim otherwise. Maybe we should trust in that fact. What do we know about past temperatures? Mass use of thermometers started around 1850, and that's when the humanity started to record them. There is no numerical data before that time. Initially, the observations were sparse and covered bigger cities of Europe and Northern America, and only later it was extended on the whole world. With industrialization and growth of 20th century, the temperature in the cities was getting higher despite the surrounding countryside is still being colder but not measured. Some climate skeptics claim that some of recent warming is due to that systematic error. I don't know. Luckily, since 1979, we have proper satellite data which can tell us the precise temperature of the lower troposphere for each time and place on the Earth. The University of Alabama in Huntsville has a very nice visualization of this data, and you can check the temperature anomaly by month. Here you can see that the situation is not too bad for 2021 and 2022. Also, you can have a heat map for each month, and you can see that last June was hotter in some places, but colder in some other places, and it wasn't that bad overall, despite the media perception. The most interesting thing they have is the map of the temperature trends from 1979 till today. Basically, what is the temperature increase per decade in particular area? The map is extremely interesting and probably not what you have expected. There is more warming in the north and very little in the south. What is mind-blowing is that some places in Antarctica are getting colder since 1979. This is something the Church of Global Warming doesn't want you to know, because the only explanation here is that you have some other components which affects the climate locally and they are stronger than CO2. But I will leave this for my second video. There is a common alarmist theory of the hordes of climate refugees living in tropical and equatorial areas which will flood Europe and America as soon as it will be too hot to live there. The map shows that these areas are least affected by temperature changes. What about droughts? Another hidden truth is that warm weather increases precipitation. This is confirmed with data, and IPCC surprisingly agrees with that fact. Here's the 6th IPCC assessment report, and prediction of what will happen if global temperature reaches 1.5 Celsius, 2 Celsius, and 4 Celsius. I'm not sure how they come up with these models, but precipitation will increase pretty much everywhere except in the ocean. Indeed, there is a scientific consensus that the current global warming is good for agriculture. There is a debatable question how much more the temperature increase is needed until the reverse effect occurs, but the fear of apocalyptic drought is just fantasies of the left, not a science. Okay, finally the most important question, which took me a while to crack. How do scientists reconstruct the temperature before 1850? We don't have any precise observations, so they have to use something called temperature proxies and then do some correlation. As a mathematician, I'm capable of understanding the math part, but I have no clue about climate proxies. Therefore, I found the book written by pro-climate change scientists to explain that part to me. It's called Surface Temperature Reconstruction for the Last 2000 Years, from 2006, and trust me, not much changed in the science of paleoclimatology since then, just they have some more data to work with. This book starts with summary section with various inconsistent reconstruction of temperature as usual. Then they say that Little Ice Age and medieval warm period is supported by multiple pieces of evidence. But the exact timing and duration of warm periods may have varied from region to region, and the magnitude and geographic extent of the warms are uncertain. Uncertain? I thought the science was settled. Then they're saying that they are highly confident in reconstructed temperatures over the last 4th century, and that now is the warmest period, which makes sense since we had a Little Ice Age prior 1850. Then there is quite shocking statement. Less confidence can be placed in large-scale surface temperature reconstruction for the period from AD 900 to 1600. Presently available proxy evidence indicates that temperature at many but not all individual locations were higher during the last 25 years than during any period of the comparable length since AD 900. That's interesting. They are saying that the temperatures were higher in some places in the past than now, and that they are actually not so confident in reconstruction of that period. Then the last and the most depressing statement is that they have very little confidence in reconstruction anything before 900 AD. Just to reiterate, they are confident in the last 4th century reconstruction, not so confident in 900 to 1600, and not confident at all before 900. Let's dive deeper into temperature proxies. Probably the most known climate proxy is tree rings. The way it works, you cut the tree and measure distance between the rings. Warmer years make thicker rings, colder, thinner. We know the temperatures pretty well for the last 100 years, so we can match the ring size to the temperature, and for the years older than that, we can use the ring size to estimate the temperature. Sounds like an amazing way to look into the past climate because you have so many trees around the globe to check. Unfortunately, it's only good in theory. First of all, you can't go into your city park and cut the trees and expect to find some correlation. According to the book, it only works for trees growing in extreme north or very high in the mountains, which makes it pretty hard to estimate anything on the equator, for example. The trees which are good for these methods make their rings growing in a period from May to August, meaning that it only reflects the summer temperature and completely ignores what was going during the wintertime because the growth is always zero. Another issue is that this method assumes that the rest of biological conditions remain the same. According to the book, the recent increase of temperature in Alaska didn't reflect in the size of rings because of the water became a limiting factor during the summer. In another place in Siberia, the situation is opposite. There is an increased level of precipitation during winter, which creates more snow to melt during the summer, delaying the start of the season when rings are growing. Finally, it seems like the recent increase of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere makes rings to grow faster. Therefore, the only way you can use this data is to calibrate it against other proxies. The problem here is that usually you might not have any other proxies, especially ones reaching far back in time. You might feel that measuring tree rings is a terrible old-school method and probably no one is using that in 21st century. Nope, according to the book, it's a major proxy, especially for temperatures older than 400 years. Next proxy, corals. Corals are being grown by various chemical reactions which use the surrounding water, H2O, and takes O atoms as a building elements. There are two types of water molecules, H2O16 and H2O18. The last one has an extra 2 neutrons in O, making it heavier. Lighter water with O16 is easier to evaporate, and therefore warmer water is supposed to contain less O16 than the colder one. We can take a dead coral and disassemble it and calculate the ratio of O18 to O16 in each part of it corresponding to a certain month of its growth in the past. Then with the carbon analysis we can estimate the age of the whole coral. Then we can do the same for all dead corals in the area and create some kind of a complex matching of O18 to O16 ratio to each period of the time in the past. We know the temperatures for the last 100 years, and it's easy to make the same correlation and reconstruct the past temperatures. The clear advantage of that method is that you can measure temperatures in warm tropical zones, which was not possible with 3 rings. Sounds good in theory, but there are lots of problems. One of it that O18 to O16 ratio is also correlated with the salinity of water, which is something which changes over time. Same as with 3 rings, you need to calibrate your temperatures using other proxies. For some reason, according to the book, you can only have coral materials for the last 400 years, which is not that useful because we know that it was Little Ice Age. Next proxy, ice isotopes. When a glacier is being formed, water is coming from the sky, which has the same O18 to O16 ratio of molecules, which correlates to the temperature of the air. Basically, the ice in glaciers is a set of snapshots of the O ratio over the years. The biggest problem is that this method is even more restrictive than the 3 rings, and it works only in Greenland or Antarctic glaciers or on very high mountains like 5,500 meters plus. Of course, you need to calibrate everything against other proxies for the same reasons. But this method is way more precise than the 3 rings because it gives you the temperature for the whole year, not just the summer month. Here is calibrated data from the book since the year 800. Surprise, surprise, Greenland is warmer right now than 400 years ago, but it's still colder than 1000 years ago when Greenland was colonized by Norsemen. Oops. Tibet actually got warmer and the Andes got slightly warmer as well. Taylor Dome in Antarctica got colder. As you can see, global warming is not that global according to the scientists. Another proxy, marine sediment. These are basically a dead plankton located in a very deep ocean. And basically there is a correlation of magnesium to calcium in some one-cell plankton to the temperature of the surrounding. And I'm not going to tell you much of the details, but this method allows you to see the data for the last 2000 years. But precision and the fact that it's deep sea temperature makes this method very questionable. Nonetheless, the climate of Greenland and Newfoundland was hotter in the past. There are some minor proxies which I'm going to skip. The last important proxy are boreholes. Basically, you can dig inside the glacier and measure the actual temperature of each segment. Apparently, the temperature spreads in ice very slowly, and that temperature that we will measure will have some relation to the time when that particular piece of ice was made. It's like if you put the end of the spoon in the hot tea, it will take some time for heat to propagate to the top, and eventually the part which you're holding will become hot as well. You can calculate the borehole temperatures up to several thousand years in Greenland, but the problem is that it exponentially diffuses over time. The older you go, the more uniform and distorted it will be. If you look at the borehole temperature reconstruction, the orange graph, it's extremely smooth and far away from the actual dynamic picture. The good thing about that method is that calibrations are not needed, it's all based on actual temperature. The bad thing is that the only meaningful estimation is over the span of a century. And obviously you can't have any meaningful reconstructions earlier than 400 years. And in many gaslighting articles about climate change, you might read that borehole method actually revolutionized the temperature reconstruction, and that's why the science changed and now we got the hockey stick. Now you know why this is not true. To summarize, as you can see, the official pro-climate change scientists have only 2 proxies which can give you somehow relevant temperature estimation earlier than 400 years. Both methods works only in extreme north or south or in the high mountains. Both suggest that the temperature could be higher around the year 1000, but you can't really be sure without cross-validation, which is currently not possible. The scientists agree with that statement, but they're being pressured to give their best estimation for the period earlier than 400 years ago. Then they use borehole temperatures, which are useless before 1600 but theoretically acceptable. Scientists are allowed to have guess, and the society might have a higher trust to that guess, but neither the guess can be classified as science, nor the set of guesses can be classified as scientific consensus. The last part of that story is CO2 and how it actually affects the temperature according to science. This is something for the second part of that video, which I plan to release in a week, and I think it will be much shorter than this one. So don't forget to like and subscribe, and maybe write some comment to tell me that it's all bullshit. Thank you, and bye-bye.